The bullet that killed Jacob Grady came from a Colt peacemaker held by a man Effie Grady would one day nurse back to life with her own two hands. Though on the cold morning it happened, in the spring of 1878 outside the cattle town of Redemption, Kansas. She did not yet know his name, only the sound of the shot that took her husband from her forever. The dust of the street had not even settled when they carried Jacob's body into the little clapboard house at the edge of town. And Effie, 26 years old and already widowed by violence she barely understood, stood in the doorway with her hands pressed to her mouth, unable to scream, unable to cry, only able to watch as the men laid her husband on the kitchen table where they had shared breakfast that very morning. The town marshal, a heavy-set man named Otis Barrow, tried to explain it to her later that day, sitting stiffly in her parlor with his hat in his hands, but the words came to her only in fragments. A dispute over a poker game gone wrong. Jacob's temper always quick, always a little too proud. A stranger passing through, a hired gun some called him, though no one seemed to know for certain who he rode for or where he had come from. The stranger had drawn first, some said, though others muttered that Jacob had reached for his own pistol and the stranger had simply been faster. "His name is Timothy Walden," Marshal Barrow told her, his voice low and careful, as though the name itself might wound her further. "He is being held in the jail until the circuit judge comes through, though I doubt there is much a judge can do. Witnesses say it was a fair fight, Mrs. Grady. I am sorry to say that." "I know it does not make it hurt less." Effie had said nothing to that. She had only nodded, her eyes fixed on some point beyond the marshal's shoulder, and when he left she had gone to the small back bedroom and wept until she had no tears left in her, until the ache in her chest felt hollow and endless, like a well with no bottom. She was 3 months with child then, though only she and the town midwife knew it, and in the weeks that followed she would lose that child too. Whether from grief or from some cruelty of fate, she never could say, and it would leave her feeling as though the whole world had been carved out from beneath her feet. The town of Redemption sat upon the wide Kansas plains along a tributary of the Arkansas River, a cattle town grown fat and rowdy on the trade of longhorns driven up from Texas, with saloons that never seemed to close and a railroad depot that brought strangers through nearly every week, some honest and some not. It was the kind of town where a man's past rode in with him, and sometimes rode out just as quickly, where justice was as likely to come from a judge's gavel as from the barrel of a gun, and where a widow with no children and no family nearby might find herself very much alone in the world. Effie Grady had come west from Ohio 5 years before with Jacob, full of hope for a homestead and a family. And though the homestead had never quite prospered the way they dreamed, she had grown to love the wide sky and the smell of prairie grass after rain, had grown to think of Redemption as home even with all its rough edges. Now, with Jacob gone, she had to decide what kind of life she meant to build from the wreckage. She took work where she could find it, for the small savings Jacob had left behind would not last the year, and it was the town doctor, a kindly old man named Ezra Loomis, who had delivered half the babies in the county and set half the broken bones besides, who offered her a position helping him with his patients. Effie had always had a steady hand and a calm way about her, even in the depths of her grief, and Dr. Loomis said she had the makings of a fine nurse, better than most he had trained in his 30 years of practice on the frontier. It was in this capacity, some 4 months after Jacob's death, that she first laid eyes again on Timothy Walden, and this time it was not across a dusty street with a smoking pistol in his hand, but lying pale and near death upon a cot in Dr. Loomis's small infirmary, a fever raging through him from a wound gone bad. She recognized him at once. How could she not? His face had haunted her dreams for months, though she had only glimpsed it that one terrible day, and something about the sharp line of his jaw and the darkness of his hair had burned itself into her memory, whether she wished it or not. Dr. Loomis explained that Walden had been shot in a confrontation some 30 miles south, near the town of Millbrook, and had ridden half-dead into Redemption before collapsing outside the Mercantile, and that the bullet had lodged deep in his side and turned septic before anyone thought to dig it out. "He will likely die," Dr. Loomis said plainly, for he was not a man given to false comfort, "unless someone tends him closely through the fever, and I am afraid my old hands are not what they once were, and my own wife is ailing besides. I need help, Effie, if you are willing to give it." Effie stood very still, looking down at the man who had killed her husband, feeling something cold and hard settle into her stomach. She thought of Jacob's face, of the sound of that gunshot, of the long nights she had spent alone since. She thought that perhaps this was some cruel justice of the Lord's own making, delivering her husband's killer into her very hands, helpless and dying, and that she might simply let nature take its course and no one would ever know the difference. But then she thought of something else entirely. She thought of the vow she had made to herself in the darkest days after Jacob's death, that she would not let bitterness eat away at her heart the way she had seen it eat away at other widows in town, hardening them into something brittle and joyless. She thought of her own mother, back in Ohio, who had always told her that hatred was a poison a person drank hoping it would kill someone else. And she thought, too, with a strange and terrible curiosity, that she wanted to understand this man, wanted to know what manner of person could take a life and then carry that weight afterward, wanted perhaps some answer to the question that had gnawed at her for months. Why had it been Jacob, and why had it been this stranger's hand that ended him? "I will help," she said finally, and her voice did not waver, though her heart pounded fierce and strange within her chest. "Tell me what needs doing." She did not tell Dr. Loomis who this man was to her. She did not tell anyone. It was a secret she carried alone, heavy and sharp-edged, as she began the long work of nursing Timothy Walden back from the brink of death. The first days were the hardest, for the fever burned through him like a wildfire through dry grass, and there were nights when Effie sat beside his cot until dawn, pressing cool cloths to his brow, forcing sips of willow bark tea between his cracked lips, watching the rise and fall of his chest with an anxious attention she could not fully explain even to herself. He muttered in his fever, sometimes calling out names she did not know, sometimes weeping in a way that seemed strange for a man who had seemed so cold and deadly in her memory. Once he cried out a name, Sarah, over and over, and Effie wondered who this Sarah might be, a sister perhaps, or a sweetheart lost somewhere in his past. Dr. Loomis had removed the bullet on the very first night, a delicate and painful procedure done with Walden barely conscious and Effie holding him steady, her hands slick with his blood, her own heart hammering with a fear she told herself was only professional concern for a patient. The wound had been deep, and infection had already begun to spread, and for 3 days it was truly uncertain whether he would live or die. On the 4th night, his fever broke. Effie had been dozing in the chair beside his cot, exhausted from days of little sleep, when she felt a hand touch her own, so lightly she nearly thought she had dreamed it. She startled awake to find Timothy Walden's eyes open, clear now instead of glazed with fever, looking at her with an expression of confusion and gratitude that made something twist painfully in her chest. "Where am I?" he asked, his voice a rough rasp from disuse. "Redemption," she told him, drawing her hand back gently, though she found she did not entirely wish to. "Dr. Loomis's infirmary. You have been very ill, Mr. Walden. We feared for your life." He studied her face for a long moment, and Effie held her breath, wondering if somehow he might recognize her, might remember the widow he had made that day outside the saloon. But there was no recognition in his eyes, only a weary confusion and something like shame. "You know my name," he said slowly. "Dr. Loomis found papers on you when you were brought in. A letter addressed to a Timothy Walden." This was true enough, though it was not the whole truth of how she knew him. He closed his eyes then, and for a moment Effie thought he had drifted back to sleep. But when he spoke again, his voice was heavy with something that sounded very much like grief. "I do not suppose you know what kind of man I am then, What I have done. Effie's throat tightened. She thought of a dozen answers she might give, cruel ones and kind ones alike, but in the end she said only, "I know you are a man who needs tending, and that is enough for me to know for now. Rest, Mr. Walden. There will be time enough for confessions later when you are stronger." He seemed to accept this, and drifted into a more natural sleep, and Effie sat beside him long into the night, turning over in her mind the strange tangle of feelings that had taken root in her heart, feelings she was not yet ready to name. The weeks that followed were slow ones, filled with the small rhythms of nursing a man back to health. Timothy Walden was not strong enough to leave his cot for nearly 2 weeks, and even after that his recovery was gradual, marked by good days and bad, by moments of frustration when his body would not do what his will demanded of it. Effie came to the infirmary each morning before dawn, and often stayed well past dark, changing his bandages, bringing him broth and later solid food as his strength returned, reading to him from the few books Dr. Loomis kept on his shelf when the long hours grew tedious. She learned in this time that Timothy Walden was not at all the man she had imagined him to be in the months since Jacob's death. She had pictured in her grief a cold and heartless killer, a man who took lives without conscience or care. What she found instead was a man haunted by his own past, quiet and thoughtful, quick to apologize when his pain made him short-tempered, and possessed of a dry, gentle humor that sometimes caught her entirely by surprise, drawing laughter from her before she could stop herself. He told her slowly, over the course of many quiet afternoons, something of his story. He had been a soldier once, in the war back east, though he did not speak much of that time except to say it had changed him in ways he was still trying to understand. Afterward he had drifted west, taking work where he could find it, sometimes as a ranch hand sometimes, when the ranch work grew scarce, as a hired gun for men who needed protection or men who needed debts collected, though he said this last with a heavy shame in his voice that told Effie he was not proud of that particular trade. "I never wanted to be a killer," he told her one evening, as she sat mending a shirt beside his cot while he ate the supper she had brought him. "It was never a thing I chose, not really. It was simply a thing I was good at, and a man has to eat, and there were not many other ways for a man like me to earn a living out here. But every time," and here his voice dropped low, almost to a whisper, "every time it happens, something in me dies along with the other man. I do not think there is much of my soul left some days." Effie's needle paused in the fabric. She thought of Jacob, of the life they might have had together, of the child she had lost. She wanted, in that moment, to tell him the truth, to see what he would say, to watch his face crumple with the horror of realizing whose wife had been tending him all these weeks. But something held her back, some instinct she could not name, and instead she asked quietly, "The man in Millbrook, the one who shot you, was that also a matter of hired guns?" Timothy's face darkened. "No," he said slowly. "That one was different. I had sworn off that life, you understand, after." He paused, and Effie saw something flicker across his face, a memory too painful to voice. "After the last time. I had gone to Millbrook only passing through, meaning to find honest work, ranch work, anything. But a man recognized me there from something I had done years before, and he came looking for reckoning. I did not want to fight him. I told him so. But he did not give me much choice in the matter. The last time," Effie said carefully, her heart pounding. "What happened the last time?" Timothy was quiet for a long moment, staring down at his hands as though he might find some answer written there. "A man in a town called Redemption," he said finally, and Effie's breath caught in her throat. "A poker game. He accused me of cheating, which I had not done, and things grew heated and he went for his gun. I did not want to kill him. I want you to understand that. I have thought of little else in the months since. But he left me no choice, or so it seemed to me in that moment, and I have wondered every day since whether there was some other way, some way I did not see because my own fear clouded my judgment." Effie sat very still, her mending forgotten in her lap. This was it then. This was the truth she had wondered about for months, spoken now from the very lips of the man who had caused it. She waited for the anger to rise in her, the old grief and rage she had carried since that terrible day, but what she felt instead was something more complicated, a strange tangle of sorrow for them both, for Jacob and for this broken man before her, for the terrible randomness of violence that had taken one life and nearly claimed another. "Do you know what became of his wife?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Timothy shook his head slowly. "I have thought of her often. I do not even know her name. I only know that I took something from her that I can never give back, and that thought has sat heavier on my heart than almost anything else in my life." He looked up at Effie then, his eyes dark with old grief. "I do not expect forgiveness from her or from anyone. I only hope, wherever she is, that she has found some measure of peace." Effie felt tears pricking at her eyes, and she looked away quickly, busying herself with folding the mended shirt to hide the trembling of her hands. "I am sure," she said carefully, "that a person can find peace in time, even after great loss. It does not happen quickly, and it does not happen without a great deal of pain along the way, but I believe it can happen." "You speak as though you know this from experience," Timothy said gently, studying her face with a curiosity she found suddenly difficult to bear. "I have known loss," she said simply, and left it at that, and to her relief he did not press her further. That night, walking home alone through the quiet streets of Redemption beneath a sky thick with stars, Effie wept for the first time in months, not the harsh, tearing sobs of fresh grief, but something softer and more complicated. Grief mingled with a strange and unwelcome tenderness she could not deny was growing in her heart for the very man who had caused that grief in the first place. She did not know what to do with these feelings, did not know if it was a betrayal of Jacob's memory to feel anything but hatred for his killer, and she spent that night in restless turning, praying for some clarity that did not come. But morning came regardless, as mornings do, and with it came the small responsibilities of her life, and she found herself once more walking to the infirmary, once more sitting beside Timothy Walden's cot, once more falling into the easy rhythm of conversation and care that had grown between them despite everything. As the weeks passed and Timothy's strength returned, he began to help around the infirmary himself, first small tasks and then larger ones, fetching water, splitting firewood, and eventually helping Dr. Loomis with the heavier work of tending other patients. The old doctor took a liking to him, remarking more than once to Effie that Walden had a gentle hand for a man his size, and seemed to have a genuine care for the sick and injured that one did not often find in a rough frontier town. "He tells me he means to stay in Redemption a while," Dr. Loomis mentioned to Effie one afternoon, as they prepared bandages together in the small back room of the infirmary. "Says he is tired of drifting, tired of the life he has led, wants to try his hand at something more settled. I told him I could use a man with steady hands around here, and he seemed grateful for the offer." Effie felt a strange flutter in her chest at this news, equal parts joy and terror, for she knew that the longer Timothy Walden remained in Redemption, the greater the risk grew that someone might reveal her secret to him, might tell him whose wife he had killed and whose hands had nursed him back to health. Marshal Barrow knew, of course, and a handful of others in town who had been present that terrible day, but most had moved on to other concerns in the months since, and Timothy himself had arrived in town too ill to be recognized by anyone but Effie. Still, she knew the secret could not last forever, and the longer she waited to reveal it, the more painful the eventual revelation was likely to be for both of them. But every time she resolved to tell him the truth, some new tenderness would arise between them, some small moment of connection that made her fear losing what they had begun to build together, and she would find herself putting off the confession yet again, telling herself she would find the right moment, the right words, though in her heart she knew there was no right moment for such a terrible truth. Summer came to Redemption in full force, the prairie grass turning gold beneath a relentless sun, and Timothy Walden grew stronger with each passing week, until by midsummer he had regained nearly all his former vigor, though a scar remained on his side as permanent testament to how close he had come to death. He took up residence in a small room above the livery stable and began working steady hours at the infirmary alongside Dr. Loomis, earning a modest but honest wage. And slowly, carefully, he began to rebuild something of a life for himself in the town. Effie found herself looking forward to their days together with an eagerness she tried to suppress but could not fully deny. There was an ease between them now that had grown from all those weeks of careful tending, a comfort in each other's company that felt, to Effie's own surprise, something like happiness, an emotion she had not expected to feel again so soon after Jacob's death. It was on a warm evening in July, as they walked together along the banks of the river after a long day at the infirmary, that Timothy first spoke of feelings that went beyond simple friendship. "Effie," he said, and she noted with a small thrill that he had taken to using her given name in recent weeks, at her own invitation. "I do not quite know how to say this properly, for I have never been a man skilled with words. But these past months, since you nursed me back from the edge of death, I have come to feel something for you that I had thought myself unworthy of feeling ever again. I do not deserve your kindness, given all that I have done in my life, but I find myself hoping, foolishly perhaps, that you might feel something similar for me." Effie stopped walking, her heart pounding fierce in her chest. The setting sun cast long golden light across the water, and somewhere in the distance a mourning dove called its soft, sad song, and she thought that she had never felt so torn in all her life, caught between the growing love she could no longer deny and the terrible secret that stood between them like a chasm. "Timothy," she said slowly, "there is something I must tell you, something I should have told you long ago, and I fear that once I do, you may never wish to speak to me again." His face grew concerned at her tone, and he reached out to touch her arm gently. "Effie, whatever it is, I do not think it could change how I feel about you. You have shown me more kindness and grace than I have any right to expect from this world. Please," she said, her voice trembling now, "let me finish before I lose my courage entirely." She took a deep breath, steadying herself, and looked directly into his eyes. "The man you killed in the poker game all those months ago, Jacob Grady, he was my husband." The silence that followed felt to Effie like the longest moment of her entire life. She watched as the color drained from Timothy's face, as his hand fell away from her arm, as a dozen emotions passed across his features in quick succession: shock, horror, and something that looked almost like physical pain. "You," he began, his voice barely a whisper. "You knew this whole time. You knew who I was, what I had done, and you nursed me anyway. You let me." He could not seem to finish the thought, and he took a step back from her, running a hand through his dark hair in obvious distress. "I recognized you the moment Dr. Loomis brought you into the infirmary," Effie said, tears now falling freely down her cheeks. "I could have let you die, Timothy. I thought about it in those first terrible hours. I thought God himself had delivered my husband's killer into my hands for some terrible justice. But I could not do it. I could not let hatred turn me into something I did not wish to be. And the more I came to know you, the more I realized that hatred was not what I felt for you at all." Timothy turned away from her, staring out at the darkening river, his shoulders tense with some internal struggle. "I do not know what to say to you," he said finally. "I do not know how to ask forgiveness for something like this. I took your husband's life, Effie, and you nursed me back to health without ever telling me, without ever letting me know the debt I owed you, the wrong I had done you personally, and not just some stranger in a poker game gone wrong." "I am not asking for an apology," Effie said, moving to stand beside him though she did not touch him. "I am telling you the truth because I could not bear to build something between us on a foundation of lies. What happens now, whether you can forgive yourself, whether you can look at me without seeing only Jacob's ghost standing between us, that is something only you see a N Chinese letter decide, Timothy. But I needed you to know the truth." For a long moment, Timothy said nothing at all, and Effie feared she had destroyed whatever fragile thing had been growing between them, feared that she had waited too long to speak and had only compounded the original wound with this new revelation. But finally he turned to face her again, and though his eyes were wet with unshed tears, there was something in his expression that gave her a small flicker of hope. "I have carried the weight of what I did to your husband for many months now," he said slowly, choosing his words with obvious care. "I have wondered about his wife, wondered what became of her, wondered if she hated me with every fiber of her being, as she would have every right to do. I never imagined, not in my wildest thoughts, that the very woman who saved my life was the same woman I had wronged so terribly." He paused, swallowing hard. "I need time, Effie. I need time to understand what this means for both of us. But I want you to know that nothing you have told me changes the gratitude I feel for what you did for me, and nothing changes the feelings that have grown in my heart these past months. I only fear now that those feelings may be an insult to you, given the circumstances." "They are not an insult," Effie said softly. "Grief and love are not always so easily separated as we might wish them to be, Timothy. I have grieved Jacob deeply, and I will carry that grief with me always in some form. But I have also come to know you, truly know you, as a man who bears the weight of his past with more conscience and sorrow than most men would ever admit to feeling. I do not think loving you dishonors Jacob's memory. I think, perhaps, it is simply what has grown from all the pain we have both endured." They stood together by the river as the last light faded from the sky, neither quite ready to close the distance between them but neither willing to walk away either. And when Timothy finally reached out to take her hand, gently, as though asking permission, Effie did not pull away. "I will need to speak with Marshal Barrow," Timothy said after a while, his voice steadier now. "I need to understand what the law requires of me, given what has passed between us. I do not wish to build anything with you, Effie, built on a foundation that ignores what happened, or that might bring you shame in the eyes of this town. Marshal Barrow already ruled it a fair fight, months ago," Effie reminded him gently. "There is no legal matter remaining to be settled, Timothy. The only matter remaining is what is in our own hearts, and what this town might think if they learned the truth of our history together." This last concern proved not to be an idle one, for word travels quickly in a small frontier town, and it was not many days before whispers began to circulate through Redemption about the strange circumstance of the widow Grady nursing her husband's killer back to health, and stranger still, of some tender feeling said to be growing between them. Effie found herself the subject of curious and sometimes unkind stares when she walked through town, and more than one of the town's women, previously friendly enough, now crossed the street rather than greet her. The harshest reaction came from Jacob's older brother, Samuel Grady, who had a small ranch some 10 miles outside of town, and who arrived in Redemption in a fury not long after the news reached him, demanding to see Effie and confronting her in the small parlor of her house with an anger that frightened her more than she cared to admit. "You would take up with the man who murdered my brother?" Samuel demanded, his face red with rage, his hat crushed in his powerful hands. "Have you no shame, Effie? No loyalty to Jacob's memory? I always thought you a decent woman, but this is beyond anything I could have imagined." "Samuel," Effie said, trying to keep her voice steady despite the trembling she felt inside, "I understand your anger. I have wrestled with these very same feelings myself, more than you could know. But I did not seek this out. I did not know when I agreed to nurse a stranger back to health that he was the man responsible for Jacob's death. By the time I learned the truth, or rather, by the time I recognized him, other feelings had already begun to complicate matters that I did not expect." "Other feelings," Samuel repeated bitterly. "You mean to tell me you have fallen in love with him, with the man who put a bullet in my brother's chest?" "I do not expect you to understand it," Effie said, tears welling in her eyes despite her efforts to remain composed. "I barely understand it myself, some days. But Timothy Walden is not the cold-blooded killer you imagine him to be, Samuel. He has carried the weight of that day as heavily as I have carried my grief. Perhaps more heavily, for at least I have never had to live with the knowledge of having taken a life." Samuel's jaw tightened, and for a moment Effie feared he might do something rash, might seek out Timothy himself and demand some further reckoning. But instead he simply shook his head slowly, his anger giving way to something more like weary sorrow. "Jacob loved you very much," he said quietly. "He would want you to be happy, I suppose, wherever that happiness might be found. But I cannot pretend to be glad about this, Effie. I cannot sit across a table from that man and call him family, not after what he did. I hope you can understand that, even if you cannot understand my anger." "I understand," Effie said softly. "And I would never ask you to forgive him, Samuel, or to forget what happened. I only ask that you not stand between whatever happiness I might find and my own right to seek it, after everything I have endured this past year." Samuel left without further argument, though the visit weighed heavily on Effie's heart in the days that followed, and she found herself wondering, in her darker moments, whether the town's judgment might prove too heavy a burden for whatever fragile love was growing between herself and Timothy Walden. Timothy, for his part, faced his own share of difficulty in the wake of the town's discovery of their history. Some of the rougher men in town, friends of Jacob's from his poker-playing days, made their displeasure known in less diplomatic ways than Samuel Grady had, and there was one tense evening at the Golden Spur Saloon when a drunk man named Curtis Bailey attempted to goad Timothy into a fight, calling him a murderer and worse, loud enough for half the saloon to hear. Timothy, to his credit, did not rise to the provocation, though Effie heard later from Dr. Loomis, who had been present, that his hands had trembled with the effort of restraint, and that he had simply set down his glass and walked out into the night rather than let the confrontation escalate into something violent. It was, perhaps, the clearest evidence Effie had yet seen of how truly Timothy had changed from the man who had once made his living by the swiftness of his gun. "I cannot keep bringing trouble to your door," Timothy told her one evening, some weeks after the truth had come out, as they sat together on the small porch of her house, the crickets singing in the tall grass around them. "Perhaps it would be better for both of us if I moved on from Redemption, found some other town where my past does not follow so closely on my heels, where you might find peace without the constant reminder of what happened between us. Is that truly what you want?" Effie asked, studying his face carefully in the dim light of the evening. "No," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "It is very much not what I want. I want to stay here with you and build whatever life we might build together if you will still have me after everything. But I do not wish to cause you further pain or hardship, Effie. You have suffered enough already because of me." Effie reached out and took his hand in both of hers, holding it firmly. "The suffering I have endured this past year came from Jacob's death, Timothy, not from you specifically, and not from the love that has grown between us since. If we let the town's judgment or Samuel's anger drive us apart now, I fear we would only be trading one form of suffering for another, and I do not think that is what either of us truly wants." "Then what do you propose we do?" Timothy asked, searching her face with an intensity that made her heart race. "I propose," Effie said, her voice growing steadier with each word, "that we stay here in Redemption, and that we build our life together in the open, without shame or secrecy, and that we let time show this town that what has grown between us is not some scandalous betrayal, but something honest and good, born from tragedy but not defined by it. I propose that we give this town and ourselves the chance to see that people can change, that grief can transform into something other than bitterness, and that love, when it is true, does not always follow the paths we expect it to follow." Timothy stared at her for a long moment, and then slowly a smile spread across his face, the first truly unguarded smile she had seen from him since the truth had come between them. "You are a remarkable woman, Effie Grady," he said softly. "I do not think I deserve you, not after everything, but I find myself unable to stay away regardless." "Then do not stay away," Effie said simply, and when he leaned forward to kiss her, gently and carefully as though she might vanish if he moved too quickly, she did not pull back, and the kiss they shared beneath the summer stars felt to both of them like the beginning of something neither had dared to hope for in the wake of so much sorrow. The following months brought a slow but steady change in the town's perception of their relationship. Dr. Loomis, ever a man of practical wisdom, spoke often and openly of Timothy's transformation, of the gentle care he showed his patients, of the honest work he had put into building a new life in redemption. Slowly, some of the town's harsher judgments began to soften, though there remained always a few, like Samuel Grady, who could not fully reconcile themselves to the match, however much they might have wished Effie well in other circumstances. It was in the autumn of that year, as the prairie grass turned brown and the nights grew crisp with the promise of winter, that Timothy asked Effie to marry him, kneeling before her on the very same riverbank where he had first spoken of his feelings for her, the water running cold and clear beside them as the last leaves fell from the cottonwood trees. "I know that I can never undo what I did to Jacob," he said, his voice thick with emotion as he held a small ring, simple but carefully chosen, one he had saved his modest wages to purchase from the mercantile. "I will carry that weight with me for the rest of my days, and I do not ask you to forget it, nor would I wish you to. But I have come to believe, Effie, that love can grow even from the darkest soil, that a person can be redeemed not by forgetting their past, but by choosing, every single day, to become someone better than the person they once were. You have shown me that redemption is possible through your kindness and your grace, and I love you more deeply than I ever thought myself capable of loving anyone. Will you marry me, and let me spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of the love you have given me?" Effie, tears streaming down her face, did not hesitate. "Yes," she said, pulling him up from his knees and into her arms. "Yes, Timothy Walden, I will marry you, and I will spend the rest of my life grateful that some strange twist of fate brought you into my care that terrible fevered night, and let me discover the good man hiding beneath all that grief and guilt." They were married in the small church at the edge of Redemption on a clear October morning, with Dr. Loomis standing as witness alongside his wife, and a modest gathering of townsfolk who had, over the months, come to accept and even celebrate the unlikely love story that had unfolded in their midst. Samuel Grady did not attend the wedding, though he sent word some weeks later, through a letter delivered by the postal rider, that he wished Effie happiness in her new life, even if he could not bring himself to fully embrace the man who had taken his brother's life. Effie treasured that letter as a small but meaningful gesture of peace, and hoped that time might yet heal the remaining wounds between them, as it had healed so much else in the months since Jacob's death. The years that followed brought their own share of challenges and joys, as all married lives do, but Effie and Timothy faced them together with a bond forged in the fires of tragedy and tempered by genuine love and mutual respect. Timothy continued his work at Dr. Loomis's infirmary, eventually taking over much of the practice as the old doctor's health began to decline, and he became known throughout the county not as a gunslinger with a violent past, but as a healer with gentle hands and a quiet wisdom born from his own hard-won journey toward redemption. In the spring of 1880, nearly 2 years after that fateful day, outside the saloon that had first brought them together in tragedy, Effie gave birth to their first child, a son they named Jacob Ezra Walden, a name chosen deliberately by Effie to honor both the husband she had lost and the doctor who had brought them together, and Timothy had wept openly when she told him her choice, understanding fully the grace and forgiveness embedded in that decision. "Are you certain," he had asked her, holding their newborn son for the first time, his large hands trembling slightly with the weight of new fatherhood, "that this is the name you wish to give him? I would understand if it proved too painful, given everything." "It is the name I wish to give him," Effie had said firmly, watching the tender way Timothy held their child, seeing in that moment the full measure of the man he had become, so different from the frightened, guilt-ridden stranger she had first nursed back to health. Jacob's memory deserves to live on in some form, and I can think of no better way to honor him than to see his name carried forward by a child born from love, raised by a father who understands, better than most, the true cost of violence and the true value of redemption. Timothy had kissed her then, gently, and their son, and had promised, in a voice thick with emotion, that he would spend his whole life trying to be worthy of the trust and love both Effie and the memory of Jacob Grady had somehow, through the strange workings of fate and grace, bestowed upon him. 2 more children followed in the years after, a daughter named Ruth born in 1882, with her mother's steady calm and her father's quiet strength, and a second son, Samuel, born in 1885, named in a gesture of hope toward reconciliation with Jacob's brother, a gesture that finally, after years of careful distance, brought Samuel Grady back into their lives. He arrived at their door one autumn afternoon, hat in hand just as he had been on that difficult day years before, but this time his eyes were soft with something like acceptance, and when he asked to hold his young nephew and namesake, Effie had to turn away to hide her tears of joy and relief. "I have thought long and hard these past years," Samuel said quietly, as he cradled the infant in his weathered arms, "about what Jacob would have wanted and about the kind of man I wish to be in my remaining years. I cannot say that I have fully made peace with everything that happened, but I have watched from a distance Effie, and I have heard the stories of the man your husband has become, the lives he has saved as a healer in this town, the kindness he has shown to all who come seeking his help. I think, perhaps, that some good has come from all this sorrow after all, and I would like, if you will permit it, to be a part of this family's life once more." Effie had embraced him then, and later, when Timothy returned from a house call to find Samuel Grady sitting in his parlor holding his infant son, there had been a moment of tense silence between the 2 men before Samuel rose and extended his hand. "I do not forgive easily," Samuel said, his voice gruff with emotion, "but I have watched you these past years, Walden, and I believe my brother, wherever he rests now, would want his memory honored not through endless grudges but through the good you have built from the ashes of that terrible day. I am willing to try, if you are willing to have me as family." Timothy had gripped his hand firmly, his own eyes bright with unshed tears. "I would be honored," he said simply, and from that day forward, Samuel Grady became a regular and welcome presence in the Walden household, watching his nephews and niece grow with a grandfatherly affection that helped heal wounds none of them had thought could ever fully close. The town of Redemption itself grew and changed over those years as well, the railroad bringing more settlers and more prosperity, the wild rowdiness of its early cattle town days gradually giving way to a more settled community life, with a proper schoolhouse built in 1883 where Ruth Walden would eventually learn her letters, and a second church established to serve the growing congregation. Dr. Loomis passed peacefully in his sleep in the winter of 1886, having lived to see Timothy fully established as the town's trusted physician, and it was Timothy who delivered the eulogy at his funeral, speaking movingly of the old doctor's wisdom and the second chance he had given a broken man seeking redemption. Effie continued to assist in the practice throughout those years, her steady hands and calm demeanor as valuable to the town's sick and injured as they had been on that first terrible night when she had chosen mercy over vengeance, love over hatred, and in doing so had found a path toward a happiness she could never have imagined possible in the darkest days following Jacob's death. On quiet evenings, when their children were finally settled and asleep, Effie and Timothy would often sit together on the porch of the comfortable house they had built on the edge of town, watching the sun set golden over the endless Kansas prairie, and sometimes they would speak of that terrible day so many years before, not with the sharp pain of old grief, but with a kind of gentle acknowledgement of how far they had come, how strange and mysterious the workings of fate and forgiveness could be. "I still think of him sometimes," Timothy admitted one such evening, some 10 years after their wedding, as their eldest son Jacob, now a strapping boy of 9, chased fireflies in the yard below with his younger siblings. "Your Jacob, I mean. I think of the man he might have been, the father he might have become to your children, and I feel the weight of what I took from this world, from you, from him." "I think of him too," Effie said softly, resting her head against Timothy's shoulder as they watched their children play in the fading light. "I always will, in some quiet corner of my heart. But I have also come to believe, Timothy, that Jacob's death, terrible as it was, led me eventually to this life, to you, to our children, to a happiness I might never have found otherwise. I do not say this to diminish the tragedy of what happened, or the wrong that was done. I only say it because I believe that even from the darkest tragedies, some good can eventually grow, if we are brave enough and open enough to let it." Timothy took her hand in his, weathered now from years of both gunfighting in his youth and healing in his later years, and pressed a gentle kiss to her palm. "You saved me, Effie," he said quietly. "Not just from the fever that nearly killed me that first terrible night, but from the darkness I carried in my soul, the guilt that might have consumed me entirely if you had not shown me such unexpected grace. I do not know what I did in this life to deserve such love, but I promise you, every single day, I will try to be worthy of it." "You already are," Effie whispered, and as the last light faded from the sky and the first stars began to appear over the vast Kansas prairie, they sat together in comfortable silence, two people who had found their way from tragedy to redemption, from violence to healing, from grief to a love deep and abiding enough to last them the rest of their days. Their children grew up strong and healthy on the Kansas plains, each of them hearing in time the full story of how their parents had come together, a story that became, in their family's telling, not one of scandal or shame, but of the remarkable power of forgiveness, and the strange, mysterious ways that love could bloom even in the most unlikely and difficult circumstances. Jacob Ezra Walden grew up to become a doctor himself, following in his father's footsteps and eventually taking over the family practice, when Timothy's own hands grew too weathered with age for the delicate work of surgery, while Ruth married a local rancher's son and raised her own family on a homestead not far from her parents', and young Samuel took to ranching himself, working alongside his namesake uncle until old Samuel Grady's own passing in 1898. Mourned deeply by the entire extended family that had grown from such painful beginnings into something whole and healed. Effie Grady Walden lived to see her grandchildren born, lived long enough to tell them stories of the wild early days of redemption, of cattle drives and saloon brawls and the terrible randomness of frontier violence, but always, too, of the healing power of mercy and love, of how she had once nursed a dying stranger back to health without revealing that he was the very man who had taken her first husband's life, and of how that terrible secret, once revealed, had not destroyed the fragile connection growing between them, but had instead deepened it into something unbreakable. She would tell her grandchildren, gathered around her in her later years on that same porch where she and Timothy had spent so many quiet evenings together, that the Wild West they had known was a place of hard choices and harder consequences, where a person's whole life could change in the space of a single gunshot, but that even in such a harsh and unforgiving land, there remained room for grace, for second chances, for the possibility that even the deepest wounds could eventually heal into something that, while never fully forgotten, could nonetheless become the foundation for a life of genuine and lasting happiness. Timothy Walden practiced medicine in redemption for nearly 40 years, becoming as beloved and respected a figure in his later years as any man in the county, known for his gentle bedside manner and his tireless dedication to his patients, a far cry from the troubled gunslinger who had once ridden into town more dead than alive. He never fully forgot the weight of what he had done to Jacob Grady, carrying that memory always as a reminder of the man he never wished to become again. But he found, through decades of healing others and loving his wife and children, a genuine peace with his past, a peace built not on forgetting but on the daily choice to live a life of service and love that honored, in its own quiet way, the terrible cost of that single violent afternoon so many years before. When Timothy finally passed, peacefully, in his sleep in the winter of 1921, surrounded by Effie and their now-grown children and grandchildren, Effie held his hand until his very last breath, and she thought, in that quiet moment of loss, of all the years they had shared together, of the strange and difficult path that had led them from tragedy to a love deeper and more enduring than either of them could have imagined possible on that terrible day, when a bullet had first brought them into each other's lives. She lived another 5 years after Timothy's passing, surrounded always by the large and loving family they had built together. And when she finally joined him in death in 1926, she was buried beside him in the small cemetery on the edge of Redemption, not far from Jacob Grady's own grave. A fact that some in town found strange but that Effie herself had specifically requested, believing that in death, as in the strange workings of life, all wounds might finally find their peace. All grief might finally soften into something like acceptance, and all the complicated threads of love and loss that had defined her extraordinary life might finally be gathered together in one place, resting quietly beneath the same endless Kansas sky that had witnessed both the tragedy of her first husband's death and the remarkable, redemptive love story that had grown, against all odds, from its ashes. The town of Redemption remembered them both for generations afterward, the story of Effie Grady and Timothy Walden becoming something of a local legend, told and retold to new generations of settlers and their children. A story of how, even in the harshest and most violent corners of the American frontier, love could find a way to bloom from the most unlikely and painful of beginnings, transforming grief into grace, and turning two broken souls into a family whose descendants would carry forward, for generations to come, the simple but profound lesson that Effie and Timothy had taught them all: that mercy, freely given, has the power to heal wounds that vengeance never could, and that love, when it is true and deeply rooted, can grow even from the darkest and most unexpected soil the world has to offer.